Happy to see you all this morning, and the topic today is about Buddhism and psychotherapy. These words are a little misleading. These words come from the West or the Western language, and this thing called psychology was started in a scientific way by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a medical physician, and he became interested in psychological sicknesses. He wanted to find a cure for psychological ailments. And so he did research on this, and that is how he developed this thing called psychotherapy. You don't hear me? Huh? Well, the important thing is to understand the mind and how the mind works. The teaching of the Buddha is also about the mind. But the Buddha was not doing exactly the same thing that Sigmund Freud was trying to do. In modern psychology, they speak of the normal person and an abnormal person or an abnormal behavior. So the aim of modern psychotherapy is mainly to bring abnormal suffering into a normal state of unhappiness. That means normal people are also filled with worries, anxieties, fears. So they are also not perfect in happiness. But for the psychotherapist, that normal unhappiness is okay. So it's the abnormal suffering that they are trying to get rid of. But from the Buddha's point of view, Buddha was interested in bringing normal unhappiness to a supernormal level of happiness. So the aim of the Buddha was to bring about complete freedom from unhappiness. That is an important thing to understand. Now you have this name here called Mudita. What is the meaning of Mudita? Very often people don't know the real meaning of Mudita. Mudita is happiness. But it is not the happiness that normal people enjoy. Some people think happiness is to please the senses. They think of pleasure. Pleasure is simply a sensation. We have 5 senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body. Now, through these 5 senses, we begin to experience 3 kinds of sensations. Pleasant sensation, unpleasant sensation, and the neutral sensation. When we see beautiful things, that produces the pleasant sensation. When we see ugly things, that produces an unpleasant sensation. In the same way, with the ears, we can listen to pleasant sounds or we can hear unpleasant sounds. The nose also can smell pleasant perfumes or unpleasant smells. And the tongue also can experience pleasant tastes or unpleasant tastes. And the body also can feel pleasant feelings and unpleasant feelings. So we like the pleasant feelings and we don't like the unpleasant feelings. So we think happiness is to be experiencing pleasant sensations, whether it is through the eyes or ears or nose or tongue or the body. That is what normal people think is happiness. And unhappiness is seen as the experiencing of unpleasant sensations. But that is not the happiness or unhappiness that the Buddha was talking about. That is the important thing to understand. The pleasant sensation is not something that if we try to go after pleasures in this way, we'll be unhappy people. Why? Because we cannot have the pleasant sensation all the time. All pleasant sensations remain for a short while and then goes away. When the pleasant sensation remains with us, we are happy. But when it goes away, we become unhappy. So what the pleasant sensation can do is to arouse a desire in us. If you bring a chocolate or ice cream to a child and give that to the child will be happy. But you take that away from the child, then the child is unhappy. So in the same way, what the pleasure can do is to arouse the desire for it. But because the pleasure can't remain like that forever, the desire will remain, but the pleasure will go away. Then you become unhappy. And once you begin to desire pleasures, you begin to hate the pain even more. So when the pain comes, you become very unhappy. So this is why the Buddha pointed out that going after sensual pleasures is not going to make you happy. Happiness is not the experiencing of pleasure. To be happy is to be free from worries, free from fears, free from anxieties. A mind that is free of worries and anxieties is the happy mind. And that mind is a calm, tranquil state of the mind. And this calm, tranquil state of the mind also relaxes the body. When there is a desire in us, the body becomes tensed. When the body becomes tense, it is uncomfortable. So when the desire rises, we are uncomfortable. And it is in order to get rid of this discomfort that we try to seek what we desire. We want to get what we desire. And once we get what we desire, that tension in the body relaxes. When the tension relaxes, we become comfortable. But that comfort doesn't remain forever. Again, other desires come up, or hatreds come up. When a hatred comes up also, the body becomes tense and uncomfortable. So you see, the real happiness is only when the mind is calm and the body is relaxed. The calm mind and the relaxed body is the true happiness. So this is the most important thing that we should understand. So if we want to talk about psychotherapy, and psychotherapy is to bring about happiness, this is the way to happiness. Not by going after sensual pleasures, but by learning to relax the body and calm the mind. And that is what we call meditation. Meditation is where we learn to keep the mind free of emotional excitements. Every emotional excitement is a state of unhappiness. When we are emotionally excited, the tension in the body also increases and makes us uncomfortable. It is only when the mind is calm and the body is relaxed that we become happy and comfortable. So the real happiness and comfort comes from purity of mind. Purity of mind means the mind being free of emotional excitements. So if we can keep our mind calm and relaxed, we are able to be happy all the time. The problem is, when we think of our mind, mind is not a thing separate from the body. Normally people think that mind and body are two different things. That is not true. We only have a body. We don't have another thing called a mind. Even the modern psychologists are aware of this. This thing called psychology started as a study of the psyche. Psyche means the mind or the soul. So when they tried to study the psyche, they couldn't find the psyche. There was no psyche to find. They only saw the body. So what they said was, there is no psyche to find here. We have only the body. So the only thing that we can study is how the body behaves So they defined psychology as the study of human behavior. And they discovered that there is no such thing as a mind. What we normally call the mind is simply an activity of the body. There is no separate thing called the mind. We have two ways of looking at anything. Two ways of looking. One way is to look at something as something outside us, something external. To look at something as an object. We call it the objective way of looking at something. If I take, say, this glass, I see it as an object. What I see is an object. But if I want to look at the mind, I can't see the mind as an object. I can see the body as an object. But to see the mind, I have to look inside, not outside. So looking inside is to look at the mind as a subject. That is called the subjective way of looking. And that subjective way is to look inside, and looking inside is called introspection. Introspection is looking inside. So if we want to look at the mind, we can't look at it in the same way that we look at the body. So what we call the body is an objective experience. What we call the mind is a subjective experience. So in other words, we have an experience. The same experience we can look in two different ways. When we look at it objectively, it is the body. That same experience we look in a subjective way, it is the mind. You see? Now, if I pinch you, If you look at it objectively, you'll see that my fingers are going and pressing your skin or something. And that is an objective experience. So you are seeing it in the form of a body. The fingers is a part of the body, and then your skin also will be body. But that same experience, you look at it from inside, it becomes the pain. That is a subjective experience. And the pain is seen as a part of the mind. It's a mental experience. So when you look at something, you say, I see it. When you say, I see it, the seeing is a subjective experience. What you see is an objective experience. The seeing is a subjective experience, and what you see is an objective experience. You see, it is the same thing, but seen from two different angles. So what we call the body and the mind are not two different things. It is the same thing seen from two different angles. So these are simply what we call experience. You know, there were three philosophers in England. England, you know, is really the United Kingdom. When we say the United Kingdom, it is a union between three kingdoms: England, Scotland, and Ireland. Three kingdoms united. There was a philosopher in England, his name was Locke. Locke said, this was the time when science started, somewhere in the 18th century, when that period where science started was called the Age of Enlightenment. During that period, because the scientists have been trying to find out about the mind also, so this Locke started saying, there is no such thing as a mind. We have only the body. There is no mind to talk about, because what we call the mind is simply an activity of the body. There was another man in Ireland. He was a Catholic priest. He didn't like this idea. So he was also a philosopher who thought and said, no. There is no such thing as body. We only have the mind, he said. Because what we call the body, how do you know there is a thing called a body? It is simply what I see with my eyes, or what I feel when I touch. All that is coming from the mind. It's an idea in the mind. And mind is the only thing that is there. There is no such thing as body. So now the people were puzzled. When you think of what Locke said, that is also true. And when you think of what this Berkeley was the man who said there is only the mind. It is also true. So what is the real truth? So they were puzzled. And then another man came from Scotland. This was a man called Hume. He said, "You are both wrong. One man proved that there is no such thing as mind. And the other man proved that there is no such thing as body. There is only experience. That means there is only seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. There is no body, there is no mind. There is only experience," he said. So when this was said, the problem is solved, but there was another man from France who didn't like this idea of Hume. So he thought and said, he used two words called phenomenon and noumenon. The word phenomenon referred to what is experienced as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. He said that is not the real truth, because it is only what is seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and that is the phenomenon. But he said there must be something outside that, which we cannot really see or hear or smell or taste or touch. That something that is outside is the true reality. And that is what he called the noumenon. But this was also not accepted by some other philosophers like Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, people like that started saying we cannot accept that unknown reality, a reality that we have never seen. And that reality is also, although it is not seen or heard or smelt or tasted or touched, it is simply an idea in your mind. So therefore, we cannot speak of a reality outside our experience. We can only talk about experience. So you see, if we examine the teachings of the Buddha also spoke of the same thing, that there is only the experience. And it is this experience that the Buddha analyzed into what is called the Pancha Khanda. Pancha means 5 and Khanda means today translated as aggregates. Khanda is something more than just aggregate. This is really the experience broken into 5 parts. It is the experience he analyzed. And what we call experience is simply what is called the process of perception. Seeing is perception. Hearing is perception. Smelling is perception. And this perception is a process, a mental process. And that process can be analyzed. And the Buddha analyzed this process of experience into 5 parts. So that is why I translate this not as aggregate, I call it the constituents of the process of perception. The constituents of the process of perception. 5 constituents of the process of perception. 5 parts of the process of perception. That is all that we can speak of. And it is this process of perception that we begin to call mind. You see, as I told you, there are these 2 ways of looking at things. The subjective and the objective. Now this same process of perception, we can look from an objective point of view, or we can look at it from a subjective point of view. When we look at it from an objective point of view, we see it as an object here, outside. The object is seen as outside. The subjective process of seeing is seen as something inside. And we tend to say what we experience as inside is mine. what we experience outside is something outside me, not mine. The seeing of this object is mine, but the object is not mine. In other words, we personalize the subjective process and we alienate the objective process. These are the two words that I use. Personalizing and alienating. To regard something outside is to alienate. To regard something inside is to personalize. And when I personalize, the process of perception, saying this is mine, what I call mine becomes myself. What is mine becomes myself. And what is not mine becomes something outside. And this is what the Buddha called upadana. Upadana means to personalize, to take inside. Upadana, or incorporate, to make it something inside. And it is by doing that that I form a concept of self. The concept of self comes from there. So it is very interesting to understand what the Buddha has been saying, and which is far beyond what the modern philosophers are talking about. And in this way, the Buddha explains how all problems of unhappiness comes up. Because when we think about the mind, there are two important parts of the mind. One is the thinking part, and the other is the emotional part. The thinking part thinks, and we become aware of the world and the things in the world. It is the emotional part that begins to create a self. Because we see the world and we begin to desire pleasant things, hate unpleasant things. This way, by desiring and hating, we begin to experience something subjective, which we personalize and say, this is mine. The desire is mine. The hatred is mine. What I desire or what I hate is something outside. So this is how we think of the world. And we create a world outside and a self inside. What we really experience is a thinking process and a feeling process. And so, very often we find that this thinking process and the feeling process comes in conflict. The emotions want something or hate something or fear something or worry about something. The emotion is creating problems. But the important thing is that the thinking part is aware of the world. And when we are aware of the world, we are aware that whatever is in the world comes and goes, comes and goes. But our desire for things wants that thing to be there all the time. So in other words, the desire comes in conflict with the reality that we observe. Now we begin to think that we are existing. But what is really happening is, we are born, we begin to grow, and ultimately we die. That is what life is all about. But our desire is to be permanent. We don't want to die. So our desire is in conflict with what we observe. And that is how all unhappiness comes into being. This is the problem. All the worries and anxieties are a result of our desires which come in conflict with the reality of impermanence. Desires want permanence, and the reality is impermanence. So this is why the Buddha pointed out that the only way out of this is to bring these desires and hatreds to an end. It is only when we have learned to calm the mind, make the mind tranquil. It is this tranquility of mind that ultimately solves the problem of unhappiness. This is the important thing to understand. And of course, I have only explained this in a very short way very difficult to explain everything in a short time, but the important thing is to understand just the elements of this. And so, if you have any questions to ask, you can ask the questions, and I will try to answer them.
So now it's open for questions and answers.
Maybe you became confused, huh? So you need to think more, and you should also read more about the Dhamma, and that is how you can gain an understanding of these things. Yeah.
My question is, by learning Buddhism, we can help to solve maybe some of our daily problems. Venerable Sir, can you give some practical example? How can we use Buddhism to solve some of our maybe mental issue, mental problems? Thank you.
Simplest way is to learn to calm the mind. That's the main thing. This emotional excitement is the problem. This is why the Buddha pointed out, he uses the word tanha, today translated as craving. That is a bad translation. It is emotion. Tanha is the emotional reaction to three kinds of sensations: the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral. So the reaction, emotional reaction, is the tanha. And so it is the emotion that we have to get rid of. And we cannot get rid of the emotions because the emotions come up unconsciously, without our knowledge. When we become angry, it is not something that we do consciously. We don't think, now I must become angry and then become angry. That's not how it happens. It just, you become angry and you don't know even how to get rid of it. When you become frightened, you're not going to decide, now I'm going to be frightened and become frightened. No. A desire comes up in the same way. Worries come up in the same way. So these emotions come up unconsciously. The only way to stop that is to become conscious of it. The moment you become conscious of the emotion that has come up, it stops. And when it stops, you have to wait a little till it subsides. It is like the hot plate. You know, when you switch it on, it becomes hot. You switch it off, the heat doesn't go suddenly. But light, of course, if you switch it off, the light goes off immediately. But the heat doesn't go off immediately like that when you switch it off. The hot plate will remain hot for some time. So in the same way, when our emotion is aroused, you can switch it off by becoming aware of it, but we have to remain till it slowly calms down. That's the important thing. So, it is the awareness that is important, and that awareness is what we call meditation. Meditation is where we begin to become aware of the emotions that come up and remain calm and watch the emotion and gradually let it calm down. But the thing is, we have to understand that every emotion that comes up only because of the way we think about what is going on outside. Whatever is going on outside, we begin to interpret in a certain way. And it is that interpretation that arouses the emotion. Now, if someone comes here and says something, if you interpret that as an insult to you, what happens? You become angry. But if you interpret that as a joke, then you begin to laugh. Everything depends on how you interpret what was said. That's the important thing to understand. So, once you are emotionally aroused, you will find it very difficult to change the interpretation. But first you have to calm your mind. Only after you have calmed your mind, then you can look at that interpretation and you will see that that interpretation can be wrong. So you see, only by changing that interpretation that you can calm your mind. So it's very important to understand these things, and then only you will be able to gain freedom from all sufferings.